Meeting called on today's Tuesday, January 21st. I went back in time. It was about 6:32 p.m. Town council meeting at Town Council Chambers, 1170 Main Street.
Roll call, Councilman Dennison.
Here.
Councilman Lichardi.
Here.
Councilman Messier.
Here.
Council Vice President Williamson.
Here.
Council President Gosler.
Here.
Quorum is declared. New business, school building committee update.
Who wants to give it? We've been pretty much giving updates all night.
The next two things will accommodate the front third of our chambers, so moving right along, the first one's the school building committee update. As most of you are aware, we met at 5 o'clock today to review the most up-to-date proposal for our stage 2 submission to RIDE, which is due on February 15th. So I think we've clearly mapped out the proposed additions and changes to our various facilities, and now we're fine-tuning some cost and timing. So that is still a work in progress. As a reminder, we have our 4th and final community engagement on this process. That's tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock at the high school in the media center on the 2nd floor, where the material that was shared tonight will be shared more broadly to the public and the school groups that attend. So we encourage attendance. I'll probably send out a code red calls tomorrow at some point as a reminder. And then finally, coming up on February, assuming all that works together, we'll have a joint meeting of the school committee and the council on February 12th for the council to ultimately act, hopefully, on the school committee's recommendation to forward the stage 2 commission to RIDE. That's it for the school building updates.
Any questions for Mark or anybody on the committee? Thank you.
Bond issue plan for school projects, discussion of town bonding capacity and tentative amount to bond for the RIDE stage 2 submission.
So again, I'm going to turn the mic over mostly to Kristen and Matthew Blaze. But essentially, we're at the point now where we have an idea of what we want to do and some approximate estimated cost. And the bulk of this is going to be funded by a proposed bond. Again, for those that don't know, the very exciting part about it is our project submission is hopefully going to allow us to get a return of 65% of the project back to us from the Rhode Island Department of Education. So it is you can't get much more of an ideal scenario. So it's a lot of people refer to it as a once in a lifetime investment. It's a very important decision, but it's obviously a lot of money and has trickle down effects on other things. So I'll defer to Matt to kind of explain that process and what the various levels, how it would affect our budget.
Thank you. Good evening, counselors. I know some of you have had the opportunity to meet me already. My name is Matt Blaze. I'm from Hilltop Securities. We're the financial advisor to the town, primarily on debt issues. When a municipality is considering a substantial project that requires bonding through the public markets, there's several considerations that we take into account, particularly when we're determining capacity and intolerable levels for the town. Now, I'll start with rating agency considerations. It pretty much comes down to rating agency considerations. And then, of course, we're talking about the budgetary flexibility of the town as well. From a rating agency perspective, the town's rated by Moody's. It's one of the big 3 rating agencies. It's an A3 as far as how their scale goes. And they look at several metrics when you issue debt. There are several others like economy and populations and different trends like that they look at too. But we're going to focus on the debt metrics here. And they look at those on an annual basis for surveillance. And then they also look at them for every single bond issue. And they're saying, okay, when you're going to incur this additional debt, is it going to potentially stress some of these metrics? When we look at the town from a strictly debt standpoint, from a bonding general obligation debt standpoint, the town's been extremely conservative. one of the metrics that we look at is debt as a percentage of assessed value of taxable property for the town. And from the town's perspective, it's a 1.5%. And what we look at for the target, upper range of that for when the rating agencies start saying, okay, well, without, additional considerations, this could potentially stress the rating, is around 4%. So you're less than half of that. It's a good position to be in. Now, they also look at contingent liabilities too, which can be pension and OPEB. When we look at that from that perspective, the town's a bit more stressed right now. Not to say that it would generally result in a downgrade of the rating from issuing debt, but it's something that they pay attention to. But as far as, strict general obligation debt standpoint, the town's been very conservative. To the point where for school bonds in particular, the last bond issue was in 2015, and it was actually a refinancing of a prior school bond issue. So it was really only done for cash flow savings. It wasn't done for any new projects. That's a more global consideration for the rating agencies, right? The state also looks at it. They have a public finance management board. They put together a debt affordability study every 2 years. Last one came out December 2023. They look at a lot of the same metrics that the rating agencies look at. They're looking at debt as a percentage of assessed value. They're looking at payments for pension OPEB as a percentage of assessed value. They include debt service payments too, and on top of that for just general obligation debt. So a lot of it's the same, but they're benchmarking it to all the different municipalities in the state. That's all consolidated into the report. It's primarily focused on debt though, not as much as the economics. From that perspective, they're seeing the same thing that the rating agencies are seeing. And again, when you look at it from a strict debt perspective, everything's in a really great place, actually benchmarks really well against a lot of other municipalities in the state. Again, when you lump in the pension OPEB, it's slightly elevated. And then the other consideration outside rating agencies, outside of what the state looks at, is the town in the budgetary perspective, such as will incurrence of this debt bring us above the 4% levy cap to be able to afford it? Or what type of other factors could potentially mitigate the tax increase or mitigate against increases to debt service that the town's already paying? So, we reviewed different thresholds of the town. We focused on a range of proposed bond issues. I'd say that they're in the mid-range. We looked at some of the projects that have been discussed with the school building committee to do, just portions here and there and layer on some additional projects. We started looking at 55 million, 60 million, 65 million as a start. And what type of impact would that have on the town if they were to incur that additional debt? And, we put together a little summary. I think you all have it in front of you. The summary page is in the front, and there are 6 different scenarios. It looks at 55, 60, 65 million, but it also looks at one sole bond issue, or it looks at 2 separate bond issues for each amount that we're looking at here. And, what's the trade-off of that? Why would you do 2 instead of 1? Well, one bond issue is going to have higher upfront costs because you're issuing it all at once, and I'll explain the importance of that momentarily. The 2 bonds allow you to kind of layer in the debt service with the second bond, so you can incur the initial debt of the first bond issue, and then you have a little bit of flexibility in the short term until that second bond issue comes into play. So essentially, the budgetary impact is less upfront. Which is important because I'll go straight to one of the summary pages just so we can discuss that. Let's go into the 55 million. That's okay, and I'll just put them side by side. So one bond issue also has lower issuance costs. That is one of the trade-offs. When the attorney's fees, paying Moody's, you need to pay Moody's for a rating. Rybeck is the conduit issuer. you can issue on your own, but you will not be reimbursed on your interest portion of debt unless you go through the Rhode Island Health and Educational Building Corporation. So they have a fee that they tag on as well. So if we just start with the 55 million, you can see par amount, that's the issuance amount of the bonds. We assume a closing date of just January 2026 for now. It looks like that's when most of the pre-development will start moving on to the construction phase. If there's any costs that are incurred prior to bonding, they can get reimbursed. There's a reimbursement resolution that the attorneys can do. You can get reimbursed up to 18 months prior cost, but all the costs can still be reimbursed through bond proceeds. So essentially, you're still completing the same eligible projects that are authorized by the Rhode Island Department of Ed as part of a stage 2 submission. So I think most importantly, I want to move on to the second portion of this table on the bottom. You've got school bond debt service there. It's $101 million, just over $101 million. If you were issuing $55 million of debt and there was no reimbursement that was tied to it, it would be a cost to the town of $101 million. We're assuming this over 30 years. Like a mortgage, 20-year debt will have larger annual payments, will have less interest costs. 30-year debt is going to have smaller annual payments, and it's going to have slightly larger interest costs. The 30-year does provide, again, additional budgetary flexibility and reduces the annual burden that the town's going to have to pay. So that's your first column there, total debt. The RIDE reimbursements represented at 65%, very strong reimbursement number. Historically, the town's been much less than that from RIDE. There's been these additional bonus incentives depending on what the scope of the project is, newer and fewer security upgrades. Each one of those can add an additional 5% of reimbursement to the town. That's not expected to continue. When Mark was mentioning, this may be a once in a lifetime. It's probably the only chance that you'll get reimbursed at this percentage. That's really all it means. And then we have the school bond net debt service. And this is where it gets really interesting. And it goes back to what I was saying before about minimizing that upfront budgetary impact is you see, there are 2 regularly scheduled payments. There's no reimbursement that's tied to those. And then you see a negative number, which essentially means that revenue is going to go back to the town from RIDE. So RIDE will not reimburse will not reimburse until substantial project completion. So if we assume that the projects are substantially complete in fiscal year 27, then the reimbursement will actually kick in fiscal year 28. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get reimbursed for those prior payments. You'll get what we refer to as a catch-up payment in fiscal year 2028. But that doesn't change the fact that 100% of the payment needs to get made in that fiscal 26, fiscal 27, that's leading up to substantial project completion, and making 100% of those payments is where there's a bit more of the budgetary pressure. Obviously, when you receive the large revenue that's coming in fiscal 28 from RIDE because of that catch-up reimbursement, you're actually receiving more revenue than you would actually pay out on debt service in that given year. So it's really that pressure point of fiscal year 27. I added the existing general obligation debt service just so you would be able to spot, or really get a basis of where you're starting from. There's no significant debt drop-offs in the immediate future. It's really between fiscal 29, fiscal 30, and then we don't see anything substantial really until 2038 to 39. So it's a bit of a ways out where you'd maybe try to layer it in to where debt's dropping off. There's not really that opportunity here necessarily, at least not in the near term, but the substantial offset of the RIDE reimbursement does make the debt burden of this additional debt manageable. Now I'm going to move over to the 2 bond issue scenarios. And so we assumed just splitting it in half for now. It will be determined, those sizings are going to be determined on the cash flow schedule on the construction. So if through beginning of 2027, you need more than to finish the projects through fiscal 27, then, we can size those appropriately. We're just splitting it in half for now. And obviously, if you needed additional money for the second bond issue, again, you could advance funds, you could get reimbursed through bond proceeds. So it's not at a loss to the town as far as coming out of pocket if you were going to do that to start some of the projects or keep them moving forward. So you'll see the debt service that's associated with the smaller bond is of course small. It's about 51 million for each bond issue. Again, you have the ride reimbursement, but you're going to see on the second bond issue, it doesn't start paying until fiscal year 28. So your payment essentially in fiscal year 27 is half on what you actually need to come out of pocket. And then you don't have a second bond issue that kicks in until payments, principal and interest payments that kick in until fiscal year 28. So you're able to avoid making 100% of payments on half of what you would issue. And therefore, you're mitigating against budgetary impact in fiscal 27. You're maximizing your reimbursement still. It's not like you're necessarily missing out on any reimbursement by delaying that second bond issue. It's just by issuing two different bonds, the costs are high for issuing the bonds. But it can be afforded through the flexibility in that fiscal year 2027 payment. I believe that more than makes up for the additional costs is having that type of flexibility and mitigating taxpayer impact. And again, you same thing, school bond net debt service, existing GO, and then you have the total net debt service. And you'll see there's still a slight blip in fiscal 27, but it's 4.8 million compared to almost 6.1 million if you were doing one bond issue. And that all recurs through the 60 million through the 65 million. I think just the gist of all of that is you get much more flexibility by being able to issue two bonds versus one bond. Just from an upfront. Doesn't necessarily impact what you're going to receive for reimbursement, doesn't necessarily really impact what you're going to be repaying on the bonds. If you look at the first page summary, it's quite close, actually. For example, the net debt service after reimbursement for one bond issue at 55 million is 35.4 million. And then if you look at the two bond issues, it's 35.5 million. So it's just about $150,000 or so. That's going to be able to afford you that flexibility on having the two different bond issues. And of course, if you're doing two separate bond issues too, I have to say that, there's of course room for market movement for the second bond issue, for better or for worse. Hopefully we're trending towards lower interest rates, particularly based on the last few months that we've had, but none of us necessarily predict market rates. I wish that we all could. But the impact, I do want to say, 65 million versus 55 million. If you look at the gross debt service, we talked about 101 million if you receive no reimbursement on the 55 million bond issue. If you're looking at a $65 million bond issue, that's $120 million. So just about $20 million differential. When you look at it on a net basis, you're looking at the $35 million versus $42 million. So it's only a $7 million differential. So you get more benefit, actually, the higher you go, compared to if you were just spending this on a gross debt service, no reimbursement basis. Now, with that, there are a few other things I do want to mention. I know the RIDE Stage 2 submission to get all of the projects is around $80 million, I think we all saw. Now we've been looking at these numbers of 55, 60, 65. You heard me say them before. They're all tolerable levels. When going out for the actual authorization, I want you to understand that there's some flexibility there too. So if you were to seek authorization to bond for $80 million, it does not mean we are issuing $80 million. It gives you the option to issue up to $80 million if you want to support all of the projects at some point. You need 5-year time horizon. It gives you the option to do that. It in no way holds you to that number. There are plenty of communities out there that, they have I'm just gonna use round numbers. There's $100 million that they had approved in projects from the Rhode Island Department of Education. They say, okay, let's just give ourselves the flexibility, $100 million of voter authorization. Debt cannot be issued just based on the authorization. It needs to go in front of the council. It needs authorization. There needs to be an authorizing resolution. It can be done on an individual borrowing basis. It can be done as a total number. But if you said, let's do, the first portion of these projects now, and if you never issue that debt, that has no repercussions on the town. It turns into authorized but unissued debt. I believe you have some small amounts that are sitting here and there for excess amounts that you didn't necessarily need for a project. So you can size to an actual project amount, you can size to an actual issuance number amount. Now, the way that, and I'll just talk kind of broadly about sources and uses in the bond world and what that means. You have the amount that you're issuing. We'll say it's the 55 million. You have the costs. It's what you're issuing less your costs. Typically issues the project fund amount, what you would have remaining for projects. I'm not going to get into bond math or anything like that here, but there's a unique mechanism in tax exempt municipal bonds, and it's not in taxable bonds, but it's in tax exempt municipal bonds like these would be, and it's called market premium. So when prevailing yields on what investors receive, investors will buy these in the open market. When an investor receives a yield, it's going to be less based on current market environment than what you all are going to be paying back on the bonds. If the interest rate is a 4.5%, they may receive a yield of 3% on that. The differential between both of those creates what's called market premium. And that can generate additional bond proceeds by issuing the same amount of debt. So we're seeing it around, in like current market, probably around 6%. We've seen it up to 10%. What does that mean? It means if you have a $60 million bond issue and you generate 10% market premium, you are not, and that's not, interest is not based off of what you receive on that principal and market premium amount. It's just on what you issue. So if it's $60 million, you pay interest on $60 million less reimbursement, but you may receive $66 million for projects. There's just a potential to generate more. And of course, it all depends on market environment. I want to caveat that, but general in the market, what we've seen for the last 10 years in a very, if not longer, in a very low market environment, all of these bond issues have generated this market premium, naturally occurring market premium. So there's also if you let's just say you authorized 80 million, it matched up with what you were seeing in the stage 2 approvals. If you were generating market premium on that, you may have to issue, you could size to technically a project fund, the size for an 80 million to have available for projects, and you'd likely have to issue less than $80 million. It could be correct, exactly. If you were thinking of, round numbers, 10%-ish, could be 72 million to fund 80. Again, nothing holds you to having to issue that full amount. If a project gets carved out, if for some reason RIDE was to say, part of this is not an eligible project, therefore non-reimbursable, and we carve that project out and you decide not to issue or fund that project, that's completely your decision to be able to make. But we want to have a structure for the bonds that is going to not limit you necessarily. It's going to provide the maximum reimbursement that you can possibly get, and it's going to mitigate against that any upfront impact, which is where the taxpayer impact would be, which is where the budgetary impact would be too. So we don't necessarily want to hinder flexibility. We don't want to do anything that is outside of the tolerable levels that the town would be able to repay, or would have to have tax increases that may not be palatable necessarily. That's why we showed the two bond issues. We had talked about it on some of the prior analyses, but I know you all haven't had the benefit of being able to look at it. So there's a few different ways that we can structure this, of course. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we go into 3 bond issues, because then you're just, inflating issuance costs likely with minimal flexibility. But those are the options that we have reviewed. And, again, nothing is going to necessarily hold you to the amount of debt that you need to incur. You all make that decision. But I just wanted to lay out the options. I know this can be completely different from what you're used to in the tax exempt municipal bond world. Is a very niche and unique financing mechanism, probably different than we've seen before. Even some of the other borrowings that you see may be slightly different, because this is a public offering that will have, as opposed to like a direct placement where Citizens Bank comes in and they say, okay, you need $2 million of road paving projects, we're gonna give you $2 million. This is more, you go into the public market, you have an underwriter, you'll see underwriters costs in there. It's likely one of your Wall Street investment banking firms, where it's, your JP Morgans are out there, your Bank of America's, Goldman Sachs, and they market bonds directly to investors, which could be Travelers Insurance. They all have, or it could be, smaller entities too. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like, you enter the market, they actually get placed with investors there. So as far as process, I mentioned it goes through the Rhode Island Health and Educational Building Corporation. They're the conduit issuer there. They serve as the issuer. You serve as the borrower. You're responsible for repaying the debt. You make your debt payments essentially over to a trustee. The reimbursement comes in, net payment comes out. Getting authorization from them, typically a 2-month process. So start to finish could be 10 weeks. Because it's required 2 different board meetings that you get approval at. So that automatically adds a little bit of extra time, but just so you know what it sounds like. Start it from the beginning to get through the finish line, have funds on hand. When we talk about closing date, that's when money moves. That's when you receive the funds to start working on the projects. So I know I've said a lot, and I may have jumped around a bit, but I want to take an opportunity to ask any questions or just stop for a second and hear you all.
I have a question, but it's not really for you. So with the closing date of the 26th, this doesn't have to go on the ballot on 26th. We'll have a vote before then. Is that correct? Does this not have to go on? Does this not have?
We don't have a vote scheduled.
No, I know. So that's why I'm asking, does this have to be a separate vote? Or, I mean, because with the closing date, that's assuming that we're gonna put it out for a vote before the next election.
If you're gonna put it out to the taxpayer, usually we do it either the normal time of the passing of the budget, but since
We
we're
don't
not
do
doing
that
that
anymore.
anymore, you'd have to pick a date.
So that's what, so when we decide to do this, we'll split it, but it doesn't have to be a specific. Normally we would have done May, it doesn't have to be that.
No,
No.
we can
So
work
you guys are ready
with
to
the
do it?
Secretary of State and the Board of Elections as to what possibly
Right.
happened.
It is a Title 17 election though, so it has to be treated like that. So it's very different than our,
Normal, so when we would do it,
Previous
so
all-day
it would be, it would be like here then?
we have to do early voting, the whole thing. So there is a 45-day
So it's a regular election.
in advance that we have to, advertise deadlines, et cetera.
So it'd be like a similar, but it would be just for those 2 bond issues and that's it, most likely. I guess we want to put something else on there. I
Unless
guess.
you wanted to
Yeah,
move
they
it shot.
shorter things,
Right,
yeah.
yeah,
Right.
okay.
So you might want to make a plan as to how you want to approach that particular date and then what other matters you want on it besides the bond.
And the issuance date is, again, it's driven by cash flow. It's, in other words, construction cash flow. So, you don't want to advance probably too much, probably you want to do it within what's reasonable, of course, before you start, before you issue the bonds and have it reimbursed through bond proceeds. I assume anything that's probably, as long as it doesn't cross over a fiscal year, is not as big of an issue as getting reimbursed.
Any other questions?
So and maybe it's for Kristen. Thank you. This actually is very helpful. Gives us an idea. We're going through a revaluation now. Do we know what our assessed values are. Have we gotten there? I mean, those, because that will look at our upper limit.
I have gotten some preliminary numbers from Sal.
Okay.
It's a moving target.
Yes.
We're waiting for some of the annual returns and stuff to come back.
Which is, we're not under any real pressure right now to do that. So we do have a little time to,
They have increased
yeah, okay,
from what I've seen so far.
okay.
Oh, that's for this, that's selection, right, so so we would expect, we're just looking at the reimbursement rate, because we were looking at a very conservative number, I think maybe
Yeah,
at
so-
65%, so if in,
RIDE has published that West Warwick's reimbursement rate has increased to 68.3%. So that's obviously
We
$100
certainly will
million.
keep-
well, that's barring any bonus points, right?
There is,
There
No, no,
additional
bonus
ones
funds.
on
This is
this?
base reimbursement is
Okay.
60.
Can that number move? Can that go
Depending
up
on
or
when
go
you-
back
when
down?
you
It
apply.
goes up and down on a yearly basis.
Right.
They evaluate it every single year. They enact it for a forward-looking fiscal year. And what drives which reimbursement rate you get is when RIDE has the MOA and it gets approved by the Office of Post-Secondary Education.
So we're submitting to the council on elementary and secondary. With the February 15th RIDE Stage 2 submission, it would go before the council on elementary and secondary education in May. So this fiscal year, this FY 26 number, that would be appropriate, the 68.3% would be appropriate.
So it's not like the stock market where you could say, if you say, it fluctuates yearly, that couldn't tank, correct?
No.
Like that 68
Well,
could turn into 50.
So let me caveat by saying this. This is an unprecedented, these reimbursements that we're talking about right now are generational. They are once in a lifetime. This is not a self-sustaining program. In Massachusetts, 5% of their sales tax goes to funding their school construction program. In Rhode Island, it is based solely on municipal bonds and appropriations from the legislature. So if there is a budget crunch in the future, there is the potential for these numbers to shift downward, which is just all the more reason why we're keeping our schedule to make sure that we can lock in reimbursement.
So that's, I think a follow up to yours. So that's 68. If we go before post-secondary in May, that will be locked in.
It'll be locked in with a
Right.
memorandum of agreement with the,
That's,
Yeah.
that's the fiscal 25. There's that fiscal 26.
FY 26.
So if you go,
So then we want to go in July.
Yeah,
So,
that's-
yes.
yeah, that's kind of what I'm
So that-
thinking,
You
right.
give them notice as to what's happening, I think they can expand their timeframe. Because if it's an issue of when the election's gonna be, I don't think they're gonna really hold you to a state certain.
yeah,
mean,
we can
As long
work
as it's
around
a
that.
work in
It's just a
progress.
planning, yes. But we certainly will strive to lock in the 68.
yeah, I think that for this group, it's important to be conservative. You've noticed in everything that I'm saying, I'd rather be much more conservative. I don't want West Warwick to end up like some other communities where they have not bonded the correct amount of money, or they've been too optimistic with their projections. Our goal is to be conservative, to make sure that we can deliver what we promise. So if that means sticking with the rate that you've already been given in order to make sure that your projections and your tax rates are hitting what you want them to hit, it would be our recommendation to be conservative there as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. None?
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Matt.
Appreciate it,
Thank you,
Counselor.
Matt.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for staying.
I can't believe you're not gonna stay.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. December 2024 monthly finance report.
I feel like this person was tall. Good evening, counselors. Current year tax collections total 37,530,663.28, which is 56% of the budget for current year taxes. We have collected 2 quarters. However, quite a few taxpayers pay the entire tax bill when they receive it, and it skews the amount expected to be collected, well, it should be 6 months into the fiscal year. This smooths out as further quarters are collected. Prior year tax collections total $519,768,079, which is equal to 40% of the budgeted amount. This line has been adjusted by $206,334.06 for the 60-day rule and accrued back to fiscal year 2024. Overall, the revenues are at 53%, which is higher than the expected 50. This is mainly attributed to strong tax collections and higher than expected finance, building, and town clerk revenues. Expenditures are trending under budget at 47%. This is 3% below the expected 50. Most of the operating departments are running on target or slightly above budget, which would be expected because we haven't done a budget amendment for the contractual contracts that were signed. A budget amendment will be processed in April to reallocate funds set aside for negotiations to the respective departments. The Civic Center has current operating expenditures of $335,132.42 and operating revenues of $274,033.23. The bank balance as of January 13th, 2025 is $12,271,091.08. We earned an additional $9,713.48 in interest on the $3 million in the interest-bearing sweep account at Citizens Bank. We have also earned $402,699.10 in interest on our ARPA funds invested at Central Bank as of November of 2024.
Any questions for Kristen? Thank you, Kristen.
You're welcome.
Consent agenda, approval of the minutes from the January 7th, 2025 regular town council meeting.
Move the consent agenda.
Second, moving second, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Business licenses.
Move the business licenses.
Second, moving second, any discussion? Any public discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Appointments and resignations. Request from Paul Ventura for reappointment to the Juvenile Hearing Board for term ending December 2028.
Move the appointment.
Second, moving second, Paul's very experienced with juveniles, retired from the DCYF. Does a very good job on this board, so very qualified. Any other comments? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Request from James Mitchell for reappointment to the West Warwick Public Library Board of Trustees for term ending February 2028.
Move the appointment.
Second. Move to second, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Request from Nancy LeBlanc for reappointment to the Board of Canvassers for term ending March 2031.
Move the appointment.
Second. Move to second, Nancy's very involved, she's been, doing this for she's been doing this for a long time, so, does a
What,
good job.
what's the length of those terms?
6 years.
It is 6. Yeah.
6 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Forever from now.
Uh,
Seems like forever from now.
Yeah. Any other comment? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Request for appointment to the Board of Canvassers as the Republican alternate for term ending March 2031.
So there's 3 names here. We did receive a letter of recommendation from Tammy Collins. And I also see, Karen Simpson has been very involved with the polls and working all the elections herself the last 6 years. And James Plasiak. So there's Tom Oates, Karen Simpson, and James Plasiak.
I'll move the name of Tom Oates.
Second, I'll second.
And
You get a second before you discuss it.
Yeah.
All right, now you can discuss it.
no, I just think I don't agree with the system. When your position came available, I didn't agree with the then, that a Republican has to replace a Republican or a Democrat has to replace a Democrat. I just don't think it's right. I think we've been moving to get away from that. But I think the independent is, if I wanted to be on the board of canvassers, I could, because I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, and I don't think that's fair. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah,
Either one.
And we.
Nothing, that-
I'm not sure whether it's fair or not, but I agree with you, and I would love to see the entire system be nonpartisan, to be honest
Me
with
too.
you. But that's, we'd have to do some work to get that done.
but I'll follow this, and if it's a Republican, the party nomination, the party came forward, they put their stamp on it, so I'm gonna go with the person they picked. So that's why I go with Tom Oates.
And I agree with what Jason said. To be honest with you, I wish we had two, because I think Karen Simpson is also very well qualified and would do a terrific job. I don't know Mr. Plesiak, so I can't speak about his qualifications, but the fact that the head of the Republican Party, town committee,
Good choice.
And that's kind of where
Yep.
I'm at. I mean, I was the last example of this situation. And I think it would be a little hypocritical of me to recommend anybody other than who the party recommends. So, and knowing Tom, I think Tom would be a fantastic
absolutely, yes,
Um,
absolutely.
person for this position. I don't know Ms. Simpson or Mr. Plesiak. I'm sure they're fine folks. But in this case, I have to go with what I know.
So the alternate for this, the alternates are allowed to be in the meetings if somebody can't show up, is that,
Yes.
okay?
And I do know all three, and I think all three would do a good job. It's not that, but it's one person in the Republican Party did the work for us, basically.
Well, and I want to say this, I mean, obviously, the person who was in this role, Pat Pat's. You know, he was very dedicated in this role, and whoever takes this role, we fill in big shoes, and he was very dedicated, even as an alternate. He was constant, he was there, he never missed anything, he was always involved with, even before getting on this board, always involved in polling places, ever since I met him in 2006. And, you know, hopefully whoever takes over that role can be the same person, because it helps the board out, because at times there are people, you know, if anybody, if Sarah, anybody can tell you in that clerk's office, during election time, it's very heavy. And, you know, there's been times where people have fallen asleep in here on duty and putting a task on others, or some people can't get to certain places or do certain things. Just want to make sure, you know, that we're doing the right thing for the board. And again, I agree with you. Anybody on here can do this job. I think all three are pretty qualified candidates. You know, Tom's always been involved. And Karen, I know, has been very involved in elections, so that's why I point out. James, I know him a little bit, not much, but, you know, he has a decent resume, but I think the two most qualified are Abe. So I have a motion and a second for Tom Oates. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Congratulations, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
If I may, come on.
I've known Tom Oates, 6 Colonial Way. I've known Karen as long as I've known Paul. Paul and his wife Paulette, Donna, and we've been friends for 40 years. And he's been after me a couple of years. We're talking about this, few years, about getting on the board of canvassers and explaining how the process works and so on and so forth. And never in my wildest imagination, it would be his seat that I replace. He went way too young, and he was a dedicated person, and I feel that I'll follow in his footsteps. I know Jim, a little Karen I've known for years, another wonderful person. And she would have done a great thing. We worked together in the scouting program for 30 years. And she's another wonderful person. But thank you for your faith in me.
No, will you still remain on juvenile hearing? Because that's a second board. I just
Right,
checked with
I'm not
Sarah that
sure
you're
how
able
that
to-
works.
No conflict.
All right.
Actually, that was one of the things I was thinking. I didn't realize Karen is also on the
She's on the
juvenile
board.
board,
Yes,
because
she's on
quite
the same.
honestly, I was gonna suggest you pick one or the other. 'Cause it's so difficult to get people to step up and volunteer. And if Karen's listening, I'm sure we can find something for you to do. Yes.
And
yeah,
she's always at the meetings.
Yeah.
I've missed a couple with the health issues I've recently had.
Yep.
But Karen's always there. She always steps up to the plate. She's another great person. But I look at the rest of this agenda, there's so many holes where people are needed. And, there's a lot of places where a lot of good people, could put some effort in. The recreation board is another one. There's one for the Patuxent River. I think that's been open for a while. Tree warden and things of that nature, you know.
So
There's a
I
lot
would-
of places for people to volunteer their
I
time.
would
for
encourage
activities.
anyone to
Thank you.
find out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Upcoming appointments, sewer use board of review, appointment to fill a vacancy as an alternate member for a 3-year term. Sewer use board of review, appointment to fill a vacancy as a regular member for a 3-year term. Tax assessment board of review, appointment to fill a vacancy for a 3-year term. School building committee, tree warden, recreation committee, West Warwick 250th commission. Toxic River Authority, appointment to fill a vacancy for an unexpired term ending June 2026. Juvenile Hearing Board was reappointed this evening. West Warwick Public Library Board of Trustees was reappointed this evening, and Board of Canvassers Republican alternate was appointed this evening. Public forum.
Public comment. Public comment? Nothing online?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All